To be or not to be? That is the question. Of course, that line is from the play Hamlet, but it also relates to the subject of this speech, which is whether or not William Shakespeare wrote the works and plays attributed to him. Is it to be Shakespeare or not? Like a play, this speech is divided into 3 acts. In Act 1, I'll give you a history of the controversy. In Act 2, we'll focus on the evidence of Shakespeare's existence, and Act 3 will be my analysis. In one of the plays, Henry VI, Part 2, there's a line that says, "The first thing we do is kill all the warriors." I'm going to overlook that and be objective. There has been a raging controversy over whether William Shakespeare wrote the works attributed to him. A lot of famous people say he didn't. However, there was about 6 months ago, there was a movie that came out. It was called Anonymous on the subject, and it was subtitled, "Was Shakespeare a Fraud?" And this is a very important issue because on it hinges the identity of the greatest writer who ever lived. Well, let's set the scene of our drama. There are approximately 39 plays attributed to Shakespeare. They were first performed in London during the period 1592 to 1613. Now the scene shifts to America. The year is 1857. A woman named Delia Bacon writes a book in which she theorizes that the primary writer of Shakespeare's plays is the multi-talented Sir Francis Bacon. Now we move on to 1888. Ignatius Donnelly, a Republican congressman from Minnesota, writes a best-selling book in which he too claims that Bacon is the author of Shakespeare's plays and that they contain secret codes. Now scene shifts again to England. The year is 1920. Thomas Looney, a school teacher, writes a book called Shakespeare Revealed. And in it, he theorizes that Shakespeare's plays were written by Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, a famous courtier and soldier. Now the concept that Bacon wrote the plays, the sort of abstract concept that he wrote the plays became known as the Baconian theory, and the theory that de Vere wrote the plays became known as the Oxfordian theory. Now while there is a dispute as to who wrote the plays, one thing seems real clear is that William Shakespeare was a real person. Now how do we know that? There's lots of documentary evidence. We have records of his birth, his baptism, his marriage, his death, the birth of his children. We have his last will and testament. We have court records and tax records. William Shakespeare was born in the town of Stratford-upon-Avon in 1564 and died in 1616. His mother was Mary Arden, and his father was John Shakespeare, a glove maker and cotton dealer who became Lord Mayor of Stratford. Now the concept that Shakespeare wrote the plays became known as the Stratfordian theory. Now I want to give you my analysis of the 3 competing theories, starting with the Baconian. Now the first claim that Bacon wrote the plays was in the 1850s, more than 250 years after the fact. And Bacon himself never claimed to have written the plays, and literary scholars who have read his works find no similarities in the writing. The woman who first made the claim, Delia Bacon, was a minister's daughter from Ohio who dropped out of school at 14. She was very creative, but sadly, she ended up in an insane asylum. Now, as for Ignatius Donnelly, he was famous for formulating fanciful theories, such as the lost continent of Atlantis. However, he was no literary scholar, and when he debated this theory at the Oxford Union, by all accounts, he made a fool of himself. Now for the Oxfordian theory that de Vere was the author, and this is the one that's had the most traction in recent years, and he's a fascinating character. In addition to being the famous soldier, he was the foremost jousting champion of Europe. However, there are problems there. The first claim that De Vere was the author was in 1920, more than 300 years after the fact. He himself never made the claim, and scholars like C.S. Lewis, who have read works known to be by De Vere, found him to be a second-rate writer. Also, De Vere died in 1604. However, many of the plays were first performed after that. So maybe he wrote them before his death and they were performed later. The problem with that is many of these plays were topical. For instance, the play Macbeth was about a plot to assassinate a king. Well, it was first performed in 1606, and it obviously was inspired by the attempt the previous year in 1605 to assassinate King James. Well, what about the theory that Shakespeare wrote the plays? The Stratfordian theory. All the written documentary evidence points to Shakespeare. In fact, there's not any written evidence that anyone other than Shakespeare wrote the plays. During his lifetime, they were first published informally in quarto volumes, and they had Shakespeare's name on the title page. In 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare died, they were published together in a set called the First Folio, and it was done by a bunch of famous actors who had appeared in the plays, and they said they did so to honor the author, William Shakespeare. Now, why would the actors who appeared in the plays attribute them to Shakespeare if he didn't write them? These plays made a lot of money, and they're big hits. Yet, no one other than Shakespeare claimed to be the author, and he appears to have gotten rich on the proceeds. The most famous of the plays is about a king's son with the very unusual name of Hamlet, who dies in the last act. Shakespeare's own son had the similar name of Hamnet, and he had tragically died just a few years before Hamlet was first performed. He was named after Shakespeare's friend and mentor, Hamnet Sadler. Interestingly, Shakespeare in his last will referred to his friend as Hamlet Sadler. Now, Shakespeare's greatest rival was the writer Ben Jonson. Now, after Shakespeare died, Jonson saluted him as the soul of the age and above all other writers. Do you think that Shakespeare's greatest rival would have lavished such praise on him if there had been the slightest hint that Shakespeare was not the author? To borrow the title from one of Shakespeare's plays, this controversy over authorship appears to be much ado about nothing. However, hopefully, this speech will inspire you to reread the works of this great author. So to borrow the title of another of his plays, All's Well That Ends Well. Mr. Tosworth.